Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And I am very happy to welcome back to the show after her very long convalescence, representative and regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser. Hi, Emilie.
Hi, Olga. It's been a whole month, I think.
I think just about.
Yeah.
Yep.
hmm
And I think because you put it out on your out of office reply, it's okay to say, folks, that you had COVID. And
Did
it
and I know
it
that like everyone gets it eventually. It was my first time. I actually got it while I was masked and testing, which is sort of bizarre because no one's even masking and testing anymore. But yeah, lots of people are getting COVID. I've heard that people who are getting it for the first time right now are getting hit really hard. And I
yeah.
also know it's really, really hard to find the boosters.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Interesting.
so I'm not, yeah. So anyway, I got hit really hard. I'm still slow and not entirely crisp and clear or able to work my usual 18-hour days. I'm sure there's something valuable to be learned in all of this, but I haven't found it yet. Anyway, glad to be back attempting to talk about interesting things with you.
Well, I'm glad you're back too. And I I'm we'll just say this about COVID and then we can move on because it's so not a fun topic. Yeah, it does seem everyone in my life who has gotten it for the first time just nailed really, really hard. And I think that's the thing about COVID that worries me the most is, well, everyone kind of gets the same virus more or less. It might be a different mutation, but we basically get COVID. It doesn't impact people the same way. And one person can get it for a week and be like, I got the sniffles, and one person's down for a month. And that's one reason I feel we should take the virus really seriously. So that's my soapbox. I will get off it now.
Thanks, Soapbox. I also, given how many people just have the sniffles, it's really interesting to try to like work through the workaholic shame, the no, I actually am not physically able to get on a Zoom. Like it's not just that I am stuck in my house. I in fact just like really like to be able to say no, I can't work when I'm at home is I know there's been like 1,000 think pieces on this, and I certainly, don't think it's an interesting conversation anymore. But we are workaholics, and
Yeah.
I apparently am one too, and it's really, really hard to say no.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I worked through COVID. I mean, I was working from home and everything, but I worked through it. I didn't feel I could say no um, to anyone.
Bonkers. Yeah.
It's bizarre.
Mhm.
So, but shall we move on to our bizarre topic of the day?
Yeah, the other big seasonal thing, right? We have like our seasonal COVID wave. We also have our seasonal tourist crush, right? It is foliage here in Vermont. And even though the leaves are not so good this year, the people are still streaming in.
Mhm. Yes, and so we're talking today more about tourism, which, if you'll remember, I think it was last year we had the conversation with Anne Allen
Wallace,
Wallace
Wallace Allen.
thank you, from, see, you say you can't remember names, from 7 days, and I called it Welcome to Theme Park Vermont was the name of the episode. And so I am calling this one Theme Park Vermont Take Two. For folks who may not know this, the town of Pomfret and I believe the town of Reading as well have recently closed down some roads to private properties that were just one was Sleepy Hollow Farm and the other one, I don't remember the other name of it, but they're just major photograph spots and major tourist stop, take picture spots. But they're private homes. And the residents, especially on in Pomfret, just felt that they couldn't get to their driveway. They were being inundated by tourists taking photos of this one farm. And what the select board decided to do was to close the road to all but local traffic for, I think it was September and October. And this hit the national news like nobody's business. And a lot of the early headlines were along the lines of, town blocks influencers, Vermont has closed itself to tourists. These like really, to me, bizarre, big sensationalist headlines. And then you get down to the last paragraph and they're like, oh yeah, this is why they did it. Because ambulances couldn't get through. There were so many people parked on the road, which sent me into a rabbit hole of YouTube and influencing life that I never wanted to see and can never unsee. But I did see some shots of the road when it was at full tourist season. And yes, there were like people, it's a small dirt road, probably like Bonnievale in Brattleboro, and either side, cars, people standing in this driveway taking pictures of this farm. And I'm like, do you realize there's a whole other state out there that's really pretty?
Now, like, you know what's wild? Now I want to see the farm. I'm like, is it so much nicer than all the other spots? Like, I am genuinely curious. I want to see the farm.
No, I don't think, I mean, it's a pretty farm.
Yeah.
But okay. I think, drive Black Mountain Road.
Okay.
And you'll see pretty farms too.
And sort of simultaneous with all that, while I was in my convalescence, I read more of the New York Times than I usually do. And I was opening all of their like travel advisory foliage articles, because this is a topic that I am continued, tourism in Vermont is a continued area of interest for me. And I noticed that in all of the New York Times tourism articles I read, which were like 10 best hotels to stay in for foliage, 10 best town, whatever, you all know the basic structure of these articles. Vermont was not in any of them. And I was, I wasn't sure if like whoever manages sort of like the press harassment at the Agency of Commerce, like had sort of like was also sick that week. I don't like, I really.
Or dealing with flood fallout.
Yeah, or dealing with flood stuff, or maybe, the flooding itself was, I have no idea why it happened, but I was very surprised by it. And it wasn't like lesser known foliage states, it was just like foliage. It was really interesting. And so that sort of like, are we losing our destination status simultaneous, like that anxiety simultaneous with shutting, with feeling like people like finally saying like, this is too much. We can't live this way. We cannot be someone else's scenery. Right. And those two things happening simultaneously, I think are really interesting.
They are. And you know what stood out for me with some of the discussions that came as I was looking at this road closure story, was once again folks commenting once they had all the facts. They would say, oh yeah, this is a private residence. People have the right to say, please don't stand in my driveway and take many, many photos. And just the surprise, like, oh right, these like people live here. And I think that is something that really happens in Vermont a lot, that it's not a place where people live. It's a place where people visit. But I think that happens with tourism too, because as I was digging into this, I came up with a few stories, particularly Italy right now is looking at fine, or maybe they've instituted fines for people who do things like climb into old fountains to take photos and drive their Maseratis down the Spanish Steps and stuff like that. tourists behaving badly to these cultural icons. And it,
There's
again,
an
it just that
yeah,
mindset of visiting versus living.
there's an ice cream shop in Paris that has stopped allowing any photographs of any kind, like anywhere near their property, basically, because it had become this like hotspot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what is it? So, okay. So we have these like people saying for the first time, no, we can't live this way. We cannot be your scenery. Um, we have the flooding and like the real impact to communities of flooding. Or in Hawaii, there was a lot of debate in Hawaii after the fires. What does it mean to have tourists still coming here when we have so many people who have nowhere to stay? Similar thing in Vermont, right?
Yeah.
Flooding and our homelessness. So many people nowhere to stay, and the tourists are still coming and using limited resources. And that's all sort of, those two things are happening. And then, in Brattleboro, the closing of Sam's department stores announced. 100 years old, Main Street anchor. Apparently, lots of people stop in Brattleboro just to go to Sam's.
Hmm.
They sell a lot of really lovely darn tough socks, which is another, just Vermont treasure.
Mm-hmm.
And all three of those like things happening simultaneously, like what will we possibly do without this influx of cash? How is it possible to welcome people and not have them totally exploit our natural resources and our quality of life? Yeah. And then like, maybe we're just like not the hot spot anymore, according to the New York Times. I don't know. I don't know how to like weave through those three very different things.
Yeah. Well, not being the hotspot anymore would, time will tell on that one. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in Vermont right now who are like, oh, phew, for better or for worse. And tourism is such an interesting piece of the economy because, as you said, it does bring in an influx of cash, but it can also bring in amenities
Mm-hmm.
that the local economy can't, like extra restaurants or extra recreation facilities that are just a little bit spiffier
Mm-hmm.
than
Or
a trail
in
through the woods.
Yeah, or down here, all of the incredible art resources.
Mm-hmm. Right, that the local economy couldn't support
Mm-hmm.
just on its own, on its everyday population. And then of course there is this idea of exploitation that happens as well, that is a very real thing. And my my issue around a tourism economy, and I'm probably a little more sensitive to it because I grew up in one. And my stepdad owned a restaurant and an inn in downtown Wilmington and lived through many shifts in the tourism economy as well, for better or for worse. So I realize I'm a little more sensitive. But my biggest brouhaha is we have so many communities where that's all the economy is. And that's when I think it can become very destructive because you don't have the diversity built in to the economy to weather different ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a flood or a bad ski season, and you don't have the diversity to bring in different people as well who are there for reasons other than just visiting a theme park.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my biggest concern about tourism. And so I guess that brings me back to your comment about, are we no longer the hotspot? If that meant we brought in more diversity to our economy, maybe that wouldn't be a bad thing.
Well, so I guess my question is how do we actually put in the resources to diversify the economy while still feeling so conscious of tourism as part of the economy? So if in a limited resource environment,
Mhm.
what do we do? What does a town that is mostly dependent on tourism do if it has some extra, say, like ARPA money to spend? Does it spend that money like trying to pivot, or does it spend that money doubling down? And that's true on a statewide level as well, right?
Mhm.
As we rebuild from the flooding, are we rebuilding with an eye towards local needs, with an eye towards visitors' needs? What is that like? What does that look like? And how are those decisions made? And who gets to make those decisions?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, my hope would be in an ideal world, it would come from the local communities up,
Yeah.
grassroots up. But when that's so hard to do when you're in the middle of a crisis,
Hmm.
which some of these communities have had a slow economic uh, recession for many, many years. And then, of course, the communities that were most recently hit by the flooding, I mean, they're in crisis. They're moving towards recovery, but and so it's hard to plan
Hmm.
when you're in that moment. I watched an interesting, in part of my rabbit hole around all these videos.
Did
I
you
did
learn
come
about Christian Girl Autumn on your rabbit
No,
hole?
I learned about James and Meg,
I
but I
don't know.
haven't learned about Christian Girl Autumn. Oh my gosh. Okay, before I go on to my sounding like a cross between a valley girl and a lecturer, which is how I think my voice sounds on the happy hour all the time. Tell me about Christian Girl Autumn.
That's all I have for you. I don't know.
Oh,
It's like an aesthetic, like a social media aesthetic, like with the pumpkin spice and the flat and the scarf and the
oh, that's fun. I did learn a new word though.
yeah.
And maybe this is a style that everybody knows but me because I don't spend enough time on social media. I was listening to a newscast and someone was in Burlington. I think it was NBC, was in Burlington talking about the road closures. And he had a blue flannel shirt on, blue and white check flannel shirt on, and the anchor did. And he said, well, road closure, da da da, private roads, da da da. But so many of us come here, like me, who love Vermont, who are all dressed in Vermont core for the season. And I was like, I
Oh.
didn't know there was a Vermont core.
Well, there's like a cottage core. Have you heard about that?
Oh, no, I have not heard about that.
Um,
Is that what I call cottage chic?
maybe, yeah.
Okay, or rustic chic.
So there's like norm core and cottage core, and I think it's just like all of the sort of aesthetic waves, Instagram, like social media aesthetic waves, and I imagine Vermont core is just like I actually haven't
Okay.
heard anyone say that yet, but it's the
Well, it
wave of
involves
that.
flannel check shirts, just
With
so
the
you know.
flannel and the beard and the hat and
Hmm.
yeah.
Yep. So I learned that something new about Vermont from someone who isn't from Vermont. um, but what were we talking about? Emily,
I
I
don't know.
thought you were the one with the COVID brain.
Mm. You were learning something when you were, I don't think you were going to talk about the Vermont core. I think you were going to say something.
Oh, yes. So I did come across a couple videos. You come across the standard 10 reasons to move to Vermont. Why is everyone moving to Vermont? 10 best places to live. Vermont's up on that list, blah, 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 those kind of videos. But then I came across also just as many why you shouldn't move to Vermont and why people regret moving to Vermont and all those things. And they usually talk about high taxes and high cost of living, to which I'm screaming at the video, low wages, low wages. You forget the low wages. Um, but one thing this person said that I thought was interesting was we have such a low population that we don't have a lot of those population centers like a city, like Boston, like New York, like San Francisco, like Montreal, London, whatever, where the population is enough that there's a bunch of different industries and a bunch of different opportunities to kind of draw people and keep them there.
Yeah.
And so as a result, it's sort of why we've defaulted to tourism and outdoor recreation, because we don't necessarily have the industry jobs that might pull people in.
I mean,
That
sure.
that
And
was interesting.
we do. We just tend to not, we have like the optical industry
Hmm.
is a huge thing down here. And Burlington is like has like a pretty significant IT sector. And, Springfield keeps on trying on the manufacture, the contemporary modern manufacturing.
Hmm.
Um, and the kingdom actually has a lot of furniture manufacturing.
It's true.
But it's often like one company. And so if you work there and then what comes next, and a lot of that, there's policy reasons that keep sort of those monopolies, like non-compete clauses, for instance, really keeps people
Hmm.
from sort of branching out with the skills they have. What if they're going to stay in Vermont? Um, in thinking about those sort of resource investments we make, even farming and agritourism, if you're making decisions about your farm and you know that some of your revenue comes from people visiting the farm rather than people buying products from the farm, or in order for people to buy products from the farm, they need to think the farm is pretty, you're going to make very different choices about how you're investing in your farm. And it might not
Hmm.
be about sort of soil quality or animal health. It might be about like, using prettier fencing, right?
Right.
And that
Or
impacts all of us when those decisions are made.
yes. Yep. Um, I often find it interesting. I went into some of the comments on these videos, and at least in this world of that one video, a number of people were talking about having grown up in Vermont and how much they love it, or how they've retired to Vermont and they love it. And I sometimes wonder, I have no data on this, but I wonder if economically we're also diverse enough to make different decisions. Because if you are retired and therefore your money is not coming, like your income isn't coming from the local economy,
Mm-hmm.
you can make different decisions too at
Mm-hmm.
town meeting about whether or not a new business gets zoned, or a road gets paved, or whether you just want to protect that postcard that you moved here, you know, to see every day. And if you're down far enough in the on the income ladder, then you don't necessarily have the resources to impact the local economy either,
Mm-hmm.
um in the same way. And so it feels to me sometimes there's some stagnation there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that making sense?
It is. And it's sort of part also for me about, especially in tourist towns, we tend to see like a lot of representation from like ski executives
Mm-hmm.
on select boards or zoning boards. It's like who has the resources to make what decisions, and then who has the resources to show up at the table. Is that sort of what you're trying to get at,
Mm-hmm.
or am
Thank
I
you.
okay?
Yeah, that's a much better way of putting it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I wasn't trying to rephrase what you said, Olga. I don't know if it was a better way of saying it. I think the way you said it was great. Um, I was just trying to show you that I heard you. So I guess I really want to hear from like other Vermont. Like I feel like I've talked about this forever
Mm-hmm.
to the point of torturing some people I've been around, right? And you and I have talked about this so much. It's something that I brought up really regularly when I was on the Commerce Committee. And I still don't know what the path forward is. And I still don't know if like we're the only two people in the world that care, right? That like think that this is something that deserves attention. And so I
Mm-hmm.
want to like, I'm curious to hear from people if people like want to
Yeah.
write into the happy hour or write to me directly, but just like, what would a Vermont
Mm-hmm.
look like that maybe did invest in something else? Or what would it mean to have an economy and a tourism sector that was more respectful of the needs of the folks who lived here?
Yeah. Yep.
And maybe that's
And
like your service jobs pay a living wage and have benefits, or
mm-hmm.
traffic laws are more enforced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I will just add to this. yes, I would love to hear from people too. I know where I grew up, because so much of the economy relied on tourism, that saying I used to get hushed all the time, like, oh no, no, we love our tourists, we don't want them to feel unwelcome. Don't you
Hmm.
say anything negative. Nope, nope,
Yeah.
nope, nope. We can't. And to me, that also speaks of a mono economy, when you're afraid to say anything negative, because you're just so reliant on this one employer or this one person or this one sector, or whatever it is. And to me, that's not healthy, when you have to be afraid, because I don't want people to feel unwelcome, but I also think it's important that farms aren't having people trape through their field to take a picture with their cows, when you're like, big animal,
Electric
big
fence.
animal, electric fence. Yeah, uneven ground. um that's a whole other level
Hmm.
of concern for some people, I think.
Hmm.
We are just out of time for this first half. So, folks, if you do have thoughts on this, positive, negative, neutral, whatever, you can email us at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. And both of us can see those emails, or you can contact Emilie directly through her emiliekornheiser.org, where she has all her social media.
All the things.
All the things. Okay, we'll be right back here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining me, I am speaking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, yay, who's back on the
Yay.
show. And we were talking in the first half about tourism and our reliance on it as a state. And we're now going to shift to flood mitigation. But before we do that, I just wanted to say, Emilie, oh, wait a minute, Emilie.
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, those of the host and the guests, respectively, not the station nor their employers, friends, or pets. Who said it while I was gone, Olga?
Usually me, but there were a couple times I threw it to the guests, and some of them, like Mike McCarthy, I was impressed. He got through
Okay,
it.
very nice.
I tried to make John Walters do it, and he's like, no. um, I want to say one more thing about social media before we switch to the flooding that happened this summer. And it's my thought. I was watching some of these influencer videos and thinking about, as a journalist, I've been told what I can and cannot photograph, what I can and cannot record in public private spaces. And believe it or not, there are rules journalists are supposed to follow.
I
And
very much believe that. You have a very clear code of ethics.
why, thank you, darling. And social media, it doesn't have that same ethos. It doesn't have that same culture. And
Or
I feel
training.
sometimes, or training, and it's such a blurring of the public and private,
Mm-hmm.
that walking into someone's yard to get a good shot, it's like, why wouldn't you do that? Where if I'm not, as a journalist, I could only take pictures from where I can stand on a public road. And I'm not allowed to take pictures, like if the front door is open, it's not okay to like take my camera and zoom into that private space, because that's a private space.
Which, like, honestly just strikes me as good manners, but like maybe I'm like super old grouchy Gen Xer. I don't know.
It's fun being a super old grouchy Gen Xer. No, I think it's true. Like, why would you do that anyway? But people do, because it's that blurring of public and private. And so I do feel that part of what's adding to the issues on like Sleepy Hollow Farm are, yeah, this kind of wild west that is social media.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I get off that soapbox. Can I
Okay.
get on another soapbox though, Emily?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. I am currently working on an article centered on Washington County,
Hmm.
which for our non-Vermont listeners is Central Vermont.
Or even
And
our Vermont listeners, in case people don't know the counties very well.
that's true.
It's the county that has Montpelier in it.
Yes. And Mad River Valley, Barry, Northfield, uh, that area. So been talking to a number of business owners in Montpelier who were hit badly by the flood. And I'm grateful to them for sharing their stories because they probably have many other things to do besides talk to a reporter in the middle of everything. But what strikes me as I'm having these conversations and people are talking about like what's next, and Montpelier has launched a commission to look at planning going forward around disasters, namely floods, because it's not a question of if, it's when.
Hmm.
Waterbury, after Irene, did something similar and
Yeah.
did a lot of work there. And talking to them about trying to get funding and trying to get resources after the flood and having, FEMA doesn't do business. So going to the SBA and loans and grants and donations and all this kind of soup that is post recovery or post disaster. And it still feels to me, despite the work we did after Irene, trying to repair things and improve things. And yes, in
Mhm.
many cases, the work we did after Irene did make a difference. But it's still feeling to me when I talk to these business owners that we don't have a centralized like disaster department that is their focus. And if we're going to be having more disasters, kind of like the 211 of disaster departments.
Hmm.
And I know some things get farmed out to the regional planning or the regional development corporations, but it feels like people are still kind of out in the nether regions
Yeah. So we
after
actually
a disaster.
do have an emergency response system.
Okay.
And 211 is like the first stop on that emergency response system.
Mm-hmm.
And the planning commissions are actually part of that emergency response system, in terms of having like on the ground knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we really like, I think, did a pretty good job um, in sort of emergency response in terms of making resources available,
Mm-hmm.
between the Joint Fiscal Committee and the Emergency Board and some folks in the administration and the treasurer's office, in terms of like getting immediate resources to municipalities, either like, no interest or low interest loans, making sure that there's money for folks to replace their heating systems and replace them better. Massive grants to businesses to recover so they don't necessarily have to take on debt through the SBA, making sure people have access to the FEMA folks and getting the FEMA folks places. But the unemployment insurance, that's very specific to emergencies. And yet, it's like a totally confusing mirage, I think, to people that are trying to navigate it.
Right.
And even though the emergency grants for heating systems were designed to be grants and were very specifically designed for low-income folks, it seems like somehow low-income folks are not able to access them.
Mm.
The unemployment insurance still hasn't come through somehow. Like, it's just the administration's ability to actually administer and follow through, I feel like, is just like crumbling worse and worse every day. And I don't even want to like get started on the Agency of Education and the absurd non-search for a secretary.
Yeah,
It's
that's a conversation for another day.
a conversation for another day, but it's really, really hard. because like all of these, yes, all of these funding sources are coming from different places. I think appropriately so in some cases, because they're coming from places that are like have a knowledge of that subject area. And
Mm-hmm.
the world is a complex place. So you're right. Someone needs to be there to like weave it all together and support folks. And
Well,
that,
and support folks who are going through crisis and trauma.
yes, yeah,
And you can't think straight when you're like filling out a form when you're in crisis and trauma, forget it. Like,
yeah. And so that's like of that part, the part about like really helping, making sure that Vermonters know how to access the resources that they need seems to be totally absent right now. And I would say that's even true for like accessing a booster, like a COVID booster. Like it is the Department of Health's access point on that is totally unnavigable and used to be very easy. So, and I mean, I read, like, I encounter it personally. I encounter it as a legislator. I read the article in the paper, and I don't really have new things to say about it at this point, except that we have, like, the administration has succeeded in really, like, decimating government's ability to administer services. Like, they have not filled vacancies. They have not, like, made concrete efforts to modernize old systems. And it shows, we're in a crisis. And I think it's going to show when we're planning our way to preventing the next crisis, right? Like we did a lot of work this last session around culverts and floodplains and how sort of the Department of Transportation thinks about those things. But we need to be doing it much more comprehensively, and it can't be a town by town effort, right? Like,
right.
in Brattleboro, we were able to build out all these floodplains upriver of downtown in a way that was really served us. But Montpelier actually isn't just like geographically set up that way. And so they're going to need to really collaborate with the towns upriver to build out floodplains there. And we don't have very many mechanisms for that right now.
Yeah, I was speaking with someone from the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission, and he did say that there were some things happening at the state level, and he is working, his organization is working on some watershed planning. But when I felt, and this is not a slight on him at all, I felt that when I asked, well, Montpelier and Waterbury are doing some great planning right now, but they're doing it alone when all the towns in that watershed need to be planning together. And I guess this was naive of me, but I was a little surprised that he didn't say, oh yeah, this is how we do that, this is how we do that, this is how we do that. So it felt disjointed. It still feels like things are disjointed.
Well, Olga, like, let's think about the challenges of the Act 46 conversation with school consolidation, right? Or attempts to think about like work in terms of labor sheds, or how housing conversations in Southeast Vermont are all about Brattleboro and not about any of the surrounding towns, right? Or fire safety and the idea that we like actually cannot sustain individual volunteer fire departments without some sort of professional force that's going to be either primary or backup support for all the rest, right? Like there are areas of like we've been having these ongoing debates in Brattleboro about like rescue versus a town emergency services department, medical services department. Great. There are areas of the state where you call 911 and no one answers, right? Like, and no one comes. And so like, what does it take to do that regionally?
Yes.
And our towns, for a lot of like very sweet, lovely, prideful reasons, this strong like town identity and the town meeting and all of it, and this like desire for local control, which is really powerful, like keeps us from being able to collaborate because people get stuck in their fiefdoms.
And yes, and one of the thoughts I've been having is we have this, for lack of a better term, disjointed crisis response, let's just say, or crisis planning response. And one thing I think we need to start with is just naming like where it's breaking down. You're right about the administration. Yes, local control. We need to think more regionally. Uh, One person talked about business morale and how frustrating it is. There was a FEMA grant that businesses could, I think it was a FEMA grant, could apply for.
Mm-hmm.
But when you fill out this multi-page form and then you get rejected 5 times,
Yeah.
like, that's something at that level that's not working. It shouldn't be that onerous.
Yeah.
So it feels like there's a number of places the dike is leaking.
And I don't want it to be the responsibility, like, I don't want to say it's the responsibility of towns with limited resources to be the ones to like be figuring out how to have the time and resources to collaborate. Because collaboration takes time and it takes money and it takes human resources and it takes trust, right? But what happens when the state tries to jumpstart that collaboration? We saw the controversy with Act 46. I tried to just I did jumpstart some modernization of how we do like property appraisals and listing, to try to have that be more regionalized or centralized, and support that collaboration amongst towns. Definitely got my ass handed to me a few times on that one. And that's like some serious like governance minutia right there. So not like, our schools, our children, right? But still, so it's really like, maybe we'd finally need county government. I don't know. But the efforts to sort of support that regional collaboration seem to also, when they're coming from the top, seem to not be taken well. So I don't know what the solution is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Meanwhile, we have individuals who have either been unhoused or
Mm-hmm.
are trying to rebuild their business, who are who need help now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you have worked internationally
Truth.
and sometimes working on collaborations between very different groups, like a
Mm-hmm.
government and a corporation per se.
Mm-hmm.
What is there anything from that you can draw on to either learn from or share that might be useful in this conversation?
I think about that a lot, Olga, because what I did when I worked internationally was support and broker relationships between the public and private sector overseas. But it was usually like multinational corporations and national governments,
Hmm.
or occasionally a city government, but it would be like a city like Kabul in Afghanistan. It wouldn't be like some podunk city. So the difference, and I really like when I first stopped working in international development, I was working more locally. I like was hunting so hard through those lessons learned for things to apply. And the big thing that kept on striking me over and over again is a multinational corporation is able to look out like 50 years in their business planning. They need to have immediate returns for their shareholders. Absolutely. I don't want to pretend they don't. But there's usually a certain amount of resources that are allocated towards this really long-term market trends and long-term business thinking,
Mm-hmm.
because they're like legacies in their own right, um,
Right.
for better or for worse. And federal governments also national governments are able to look out across multiple years in their planning. They have to, partly because like to get something done at the national level is like the most molassesy thing. Our current lack of a government notwithstanding, even
Mm-hmm.
with a functional Congress, it's still just like it takes a long time to churn things through federal rule.
Yeah.
Um, and that ability to like really be planning out and visioning out 5 years, 20 years, and putting resources from today towards something that's not going to see returns for 5 years, um, is what we don't have in Vermont right now.
Mm.
Our state government is on usually a 1-year cycle, sometimes a 2-year cycle. The idea of discussing politically issues that will save us money in 20 years is not something anyone's willing or interested in discussing, calculating. Sure, it's like a nice political selling point, but really people don't take it seriously in terms of budget calculations.
Mhm.
And I don't know if there are any businesses in Vermont that are thinking on time horizons that far,
Mm.
or even 5 years, and certainly don't have the capital to be looking at things out over 5 years.
Mhm.
And so, and that's where and that longer time horizon, I think, is what makes collaboration across difference often more possible.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you, Emilie. What you're saying is making me think of a few things. It brings to mind, I don't know if you remember when Peter Elwell took over as town manager in Brattleboro, and probably about it was he did a lot of learning the ground before he started making recommendations. But one of the recommendations he made, probably it was 2 or 3 years into him being in that position, he put forward a long-term budgeting plan and talked
I
about,
remember
okay, we're
this,
going to put some
yes,
money.
yes,
Remember this? And
yes.
we're going to take some money from this year and we're going to put it towards here. And here's the long-term capital plan. And a number of people freaked. They freaked out. They were like, but if we're spending tax money now, but it's not actually going to anything, it's going to the future. And he really had to do a lot of education around why this long-term planning would actually make the budget more even and make taxes more even over the long haul. And to me, that just symbolizes, one, how long we've been living in probably survival mode in Vermont. And when you're in survival mode, you don't think 5 years ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you think about tomorrow, but
Mm-hmm.
more than likely you're just thinking a few hours ahead. So what a deep cultural shift that would have to be, perhaps for many communities, to think 5, 10, 15 years out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would like to say that that is my role as a legislator, or the governor's role. Um, but our structures aren't set up for it.
Well, before you go on, can I ask a little devil's advocate question?
Mhm.
Given that there's a lot of folks in the legislature, Senate, and House who tend to be reelected over and over again for many, many terms in a row,
Mhm.
wouldn't that help with some long-term planning? Because you really have that institutional memory.
Yeah, so in some ways it does, in that, recently I was thinking about how the Senate, because it has even more sort of folks who have been there for a very long time in positions of power, they have sort of more patience in a certain way, or less urgency. Like, I think there's sort of a trust, like, it didn't pass this year. That's okay. It'll pass eventually, or like, I have the patience to slowly kill it. Um, And I think there's a lot of people who, myself included, who, like, I have policy goals that I certainly have like a 5-year plan to get passed, or a 10-year plan to get passed. And I think that's true for a lot of advocates too, right? Like, a lot of campaigns and political advocacy happens on sort of 4 or 5-year timeframes. But that is usually done in isolation.
Hmm.
The things that I have this 5-year time frame on, I'm not telling anyone. Or I'm telling a few people. It's not a collaborative, like, let's be thinking about the Vermont we want to see together in 5 years or 10 years. It's more like, this is my plan. And if I do this little thing today, then I'll set up a butterfly effect that allows me to do something else next year, which creates opportunity to do this other thing next year. Because in some ways you sort of want to like help people get ready for the idea and not be scared for the idea that's 5 years off. But we also just like, we don't, none of our structures are planning structures. So the committee process, right? We've talked about this ad nauseum, similar to the town meeting process. It is like the idea is the entire conversation starts from the point of the idea being presented and you say yes or no to the idea. Like that's what a bill is, right? It's not a process of collaborative development or problem solving. It's certainly not out that many years. And because of the committee structure, you know, complex planning ideas generally cross jurisdictions.
So we have about 5 minutes left before the end of the second half. What do we leave people with? I mean, I wish we had a clearer way to go forward. It doesn't feel clear.
It doesn't feel clear to me. I think the clear way to go forward is to like ask people, like, what do you actually want from this? Like, what do you want your town to look like? And not like, what is this one, you know, I was talking to someone who like wanted more support for buskers on Main Street in Brattleboro. And I was like, oh my God, I love that. Like, I love that. I love the idea that there's music on every street corner, right? Like that makes my heart, my Brattleboro heart glow. And like, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is like, what is your vision for the future and how do you want us to get there? Is tourism involved? If tourism is not involved, like what's there instead? And for like everyone needs to be thinking about this, not just policy geeks, right? Because I think if there's a call for more of it, then more of it will happen.
Right.
But right now, what politics is a real ask for immediate returns.
Yeah, which planning is not that.
No. And even like, you know, I raised taxes today for a policy that doesn't change people's direct lives for like 3 years. Like that is hard. I know that's hard.
Yes. Yeah. Well, as I've always said, economic development doesn't mean anything to anyone until they see their paycheck go up.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't say that to be nasty. It's just, you don't see the effects of something until it is directly on your doorstep.
Yeah, of course.
And we don't think that far ahead. Well, Emilie,
Olga,
thank you for a good conversation.
You too.
And like the conversation around tourism, folks, please, you can email the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com or contact Emilie directly. And we would love to hear your thoughts or your concerns or your fears or whatever they are. We are open to hearing them.
But so please Emilie, be kind because we're real people.
We are real people and we do have feelings.
So yeah, EmilieKornheiser.org, Montpelier Happy Hour at captivate.fm. Did I get that right?
Yes, Great. You did.
Yeah, love to hear from you all and have a blessed foliage season.
Yes, thank you, everyone. As always, the Montpelier Happy Hour will be back on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, Fridays at 2 p.m., as well as rebroadcast on Wednesday mornings. And you can also find us, thank you to BCTV, and wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.